American Enterprise Institute, and it's a real honor to welcome you all here this afternoon for a conversation with our AEI colleague, Ben Sasse. To our Summer Honors Program students who are with us this week, give you a little bit of background here. Ben is a non-resident senior fellow here at AEI. He's a former university president, U.S. Senator, and University of Nebraska stadium vendor. Last December, he was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer and told he had about 3 to 4 months left. In the days and months since, he has been writing, speaking, doing special events like this, calling us all to redeem the time. He's calling our attention to epochal changes, societal challenges in our shared life together, and constantly reminding us that the solutions of greatest significance are often quite small. A shared table, habits of virtue, time with family and friends with whom you've earned a familial title. It's for all these reasons and more that we're really honored to have a few minutes of his redeeming time this afternoon. Please join me in welcoming Ben Sasse.
Thank you. I was overly generous. I think I'm the first person to appear at AEI summer programs really high, so I'm delighted to be with you. AEI's been around for a while. There have been a lot of iterations. We're mostly just going to do Q&A. I have not been putting in enough time in the office. I am a non-resident scholar at AEI, but haven't been here in a number of months, so I'm delighted to be back in the building, mostly just to say congratulations to all of you for being selected, and welcome and thank you for serving here. I know most of you, how many of you are here just for the week? Okay, overwhelming majority, but we are glad to have you, and we are especially glad to have those of you who are toiling with us for extra weeks this summer. This is an incredibly special place. Conservatism at its heart is gratitude. In my political theory, it's not chiefly about policy fights. Policy fights matter a lot. But much more important than that is understanding why our founders 250 years ago, I think a better date is Philadelphia 1787, but it seems like we should get in the 1776 mood right now. 2.5 centuries ago, our founders bequeathed to us a system that said natural rights are pre-governmental. The most important things are rights that we have from God via nature. And government is just our shared project to secure those rights. Fights about what federal government policy does or doesn't do are distant subordinate to having a more anchored worldview around universal human dignity. And this place is an institution that tries to celebrate and preserve and steward that. Yuval has been an intellectual godfather to me, despite the fact that he's junior to me in age, for a whole bunch of decades. And you all know that Yuval mainly is only still employed at AEI because he's eye candy. But for those of you naive enough, do you know that W has painted a picture of Yuval just because of how beautiful he is? President Bush 43, in his redeeming the time era, Churchill thought it was really important in his post-governmental life to become a painter, and W has done that, but he paints for a lot of reasons, but one of them is just Yuval is beautiful. So Yuval is unbelievably thoughtful as somebody helping steer the ship of conservatism and at AEI, and Yuval often starts with conservatism is gratitude, and I think that's a beautiful way to think about it. So anyway, I just want to say congratulations, welcome. I was glad to get to be in the building when you all were today, so I wanted to say welcome, and let's do 20 or 30 minutes of Q&A. What should we talk about? And name and where you're from, please, so I can mock your sports teams. Well, I say this after Nebraska lost a regional in baseball this weekend, so I will have to be more humble. After you, sir.
Well, I actually just graduated from the University of Florida.
Go Gators, right over left.
Go Gators. My name's Jonathan. I grew up in upstate New York, and in fact, I wanted to say I've admired you for a long time, and when I transferred to Florida, it was actually not in small part influenced by what I thought you were building there in terms of, free discourse and the like. But what I wanted to ask you today, from your vantage point where you currently are, is for those of us in the room who are undergraduates, soon to be young professionals, how would you assess the different opportunities that we're going to have in the near future where maybe there will be times where there's a more stereotypically prestigious path, but then there's opportunities to carve our own path and do what speaks to our soul?
Yeah, great question. So usually historians are supposed to be boring at parties. Our job is to say there's lots more continuity than discontinuity. This moment is extraordinary. You really do live at the precipice of a hockey stick curve in the digital revolution. We're obviously a few decades into it, but we're nowhere near flattening out a steep slope. And so we are going to have to be the first civilization ever that's built a society of lifelong learners. That's really never been required before. Almost everybody in human history either didn't have job choice or had job choice once. And somewhere between 14 and 22, you made that choice and then you were in a career or we've all got multiple vocations, but most people have had one primary paid vocation. And usually somewhere between 14 and 22, you figured out what that was and you were going to do it until death or retirement. Y'all are really the first people ever where that's definitely not going to be true. The overwhelming majority of you at 25, 35, 45, and maybe even 55 are going to have to find a way to learn a new skill set, a new set of tools, a new vertical, and have to navigate. So y'all are going to have to be grittier than people have been before. And so the way you framed your binary was a little bit more prestigious or more virtue creating or more predictably traditional branded or slightly more entrepreneurial. I think it's super important to figure out how to do real work that benefits real neighbors in a way that if that sector is disrupted, there's still a community of people who are going to need to be served there, even if quantification in that sector came closer to zero, and so humans didn't do as much of that work. I think I'll try to give short answers. Partly morphine will allow you to just go for hours, like I'm a jazz musician riffing. I'll keep them short even if I don't get a full bow on the end of them. But I think a lot of times the Silicon Valley centric debates right now about the jobs apocalypse, for instance, you end up with two schools, optimists and pessimists, sometimes called accelerationists and the safetyist school. If forced to choose between these, I'm kind of a reluctant optimist, but I really think there's more of a 2x2 going on underneath there. And as consumers, it's pretty clear that the digital revolution is overwhelmingly going to benefit consumers. Middle class Americans are already the richest people any time and place in human history. But at the level of production, it's pretty scary to have to be a lifelong worker. You'd like the stability and the permanence of knowing, yeah, I might want to change jobs later, but if I don't want to, I'd like to be able to stay in the calling that I was in at 25, still at 30, still at 35. And knowing that you might not have that choice means that you're going to have to be a lot grittier. And so in my mind, the great coming divide is not socioeconomics in America. The great coming divide is not gender. The great divide isn't race. I think the great divide is going to be intentionality about using these tools. Do you understand the tools, and are you humble enough to work hard to figure out how to serve real audiences with more leverage out of these tools? Or are you possibly willing to be so passive that you outsource your attention, your affections, and your loves to these tools? I think that's disastrous. Like at the end of the day, the remote, the ability to allow our consciousness to leave the time and place where you're actually sitting and who you're breaking bread with and who you love, who can physically hug. The tools are useful if they're augmenting the placed, the local, the ensouled, the embodied, but they're pretty terrible if they're supplanting the placed, the ensouled, the local, and the loved, right? So what you want is the thickness of real community augmented by lots of leverage from these tools, not the tools instead of the placed. And so I think the question at 25 and 30 is how can you do real work where you're going to have mentors that help you grow and an audience or a set of beneficiaries from your work that are real. And then as the leverage of tools wash in, you can potentially still serve those people, but in new ways. Ma'am.
Hi, my name is Grace Cosby, and I just first want to thank you so much for coming to speak to us. I go to the University of South Carolina.
Hi, Grace.
My question is, I was listening to a podcast that you recently did, and you were mentioning how when you were younger, you loved to work, and you worked a lot. And looking back now, you maybe regret a little bit of it. And so I want to know your advice to us young people, and I speak for myself and maybe more people in the audience. Like, I love working. I find it to be really gratifying. I find it to be really meaningful. But I do worry that I'm putting my time and effort more into the work than into the people around me. And so, what advice do you have when my passions maybe are aligned with work and not with people?
Thanks. So I did do, and for however many more months God gives me, do love to work, and I don't think that's a problem. I think the problem comes in three shapes. For me, too much travel for work meant too many missed dinners when my kids were little, and I want to be clear, like we're incredibly blessed. My daughters are 25 and 22. Our son is 15, and we have a great set of family relationships that are thick. But I remember dropping my oldest kid off at college and being stunned that this little baby girl was off to college. I somehow thought in my head, age 5 to 15 for my kids would last 3 or 4 decades, right? Like I didn't think it was eternal, but I thought the period of having your kids post diapers and pre-departing for college was going to be decades long, not the actual finite number of years it was. And so all the dinners that I missed by traveling way too much as a road warrior in strategy consulting and private equity, that feels really heavy. And my buddies and I, my friends who were also road warriors, we kind of had a shorthand that 7 nights a month felt like the threshold for how much travel you were willing to do. You get beyond 7 nights a month, that means you're gone at least 2 weeknights every week. Under 7 is more like an average of 1.5. And that was the number we built. And I just think how many trips I made and how many presentations I made that meant I missed dinner. And I regret a lot of those. Not all of them, but a lot of them. Number two, I would really treat the Sabbath differently if I had life to do over again. I am a self-consciously committed Christian, and so I've believed in the fourth commandment. I believed in the Sabbath, but it still was, how soon can I be done with this and get back to work on Sunday afternoon? And I would do a lot different with that. And maybe a point 2B is digital fasts. I would definitely lock up my phone for something close to 24 hours from Saturday night to Sunday night if I had most of my life to do over again. But the third, and the thing that I think is most, let's call it theological, anthropological, is just the myth of thinking you were ever going to build storehouses that were sufficient to overcome your humanity and your finitude. And that's just foolishness. Like we've read Ecclesiastes aloud at our house dozens of times. It wasn't a new thing that happened when Dad got a terminal diagnosis. But if you know the whoop and wharf of the first 3 or 4 chapters of Ecclesiastes, you could have a kind of um, you could have an interpretive debate about whether or not the author at the beginning is saying all of life is a chasing after the wind, all of life is vanity. He's not saying that. He's saying it's vanity if you think you can control it. Like the good things that happen in the material world, the days that the sun shines, the days that you have time and thick community and you can linger around the dinner table with your family, working really hard, admiring the outcome of the labor of your hands, serving people. None of those things are bad things, but they're all a gift that's much bigger than our ability to actually control it. And interpreting even the fruits of the labors of our own hands as a gift, as opposed to something where I could just sort of replace God in my own worldview, that is the foolishness. That's the vanity. Do you want to be calling on people? Okay, well, I'll go here and I'll try to just go back and forth a bit.
My name is Barrett Williams. I'm from Texas.
Where in Texas, Barrett?
Well, Austin area, but I went to school out in East Texas.
Gotcha. I am currently regularly hospitalized in East Texas. MD Anderson at Houston is great, and I used to be a professor at UT Austin. So
Fantastic, yes. Well, we appreciate you being here. Obviously, you've been very open about your faith, especially lately. Just in your last answer. And so I was wondering, we've been having this kind of conversations just with some of my, fellows here about really what we think the what we think that the position of faith should be influencing in our legislative and in our governmental process, and how our Christian faith, individually, how we should be pursuing to, bring a Christ-like worldview and mindset to policy, to politics, and to the legislative process. And so I was wondering your thoughts on that.
Yeah. Well, first of all, government is an amazing blessing to have a shared project to restrain evil and give people the space, a constitutional framework to pursue loves. I think, George Washington's line, but really developed by Lincoln, of the silver frame and the golden apple. Government is only the silver frame. It can never fill in the center of the picture. And so I think it's critically important for people of plural theological traditions to all come together around the idea that even if people disagree with me about theology, I want to preserve their right to free speech, freedom of worship, free assembly, and I want to try to persuade people of the things that I believe. And if you believe in the dignity of souls, you don't think power is very useful to try to change somebody's mind. So I think it's super important to have somewhere between a 1 and a 1.5 cheers for government theory of what we're accomplishing. And so I think over-realized eschatology is a terrible temptation, which is the impatience of all that's broken in the world. Wouldn't it be great if government could fix it all for us? Well, it actually can't fix the most important things. The most important things can only be accomplished by love. And so you want to create a framework for ordered liberty where the higher and the more important things can be pursued in conversations outside government. But government, again, is super important because amid either anarchy on the one hand or totalitarianism on the other, human souls can't possibly flourish. So I think my first thing would be to say, be grateful for government, but be grateful for it as a secular tool with very limited ultimate ends. And the second might be, never buy into the lie that the end justifies the means. I think one of the dangers of the way we consume information in a social media environment is the ninth commandment is never taken seriously. Bearing false witness, what are you talking about? That's my job. It's war, baby. I gotta delegitimize this other person so that, or these, let's not even think of them as people, these other tribes, these other ideologies, so that we can advance our own ends of trying to use the tools against the bad guys. I think at the end of the day, it'd be much better to stay far, far away from the tools of government if you don't have the self-restraint first to recognize that the people you're debating are people created in the image of God with dignity, and you don't want to misrepresent what they're saying. And right now, it's pretty hard to find in Washington, D.C., any large movement in politics that doesn't take as a precondition the assumption that violating the ninth commandment, that's just a cost of doing business. That's not true. Ma'am.
Hi, thank you for so much for coming and speaking. My name is Madeline. I'm from Northern Indiana. Go Irish. And obviously, as you've said so far, receiving a terminal diagnosis changed the way that you looked at life, at least in some ways. Is there any part of that that changed your political views, your political outlooks?
Not really. I've got all sorts of touchdown Jesus jokes about Notre Dame, but I can't come up with them fast enough right now. I don't think I've changed any of my political views. But I would say I defined myself a lot. I'd never run for anything before until I ran for Senate in 2013, 14, and then served 8 years and change in the Senate. And I regularly defined myself as a philosophical conservative and a tonal and dispositional moderate. I is not meant to be self-serving, but when I left office, I was by far the highest vote getter in the history of Nebraska, having never run for anything before. I was also the most sanctioned person in the history of Nebraska. And so I had this weird experience of having super politically addicted, angry people almost always angry at me, and they would say it explicitly, that it was because I didn't hate Democrats enough. And I said, well, you're right, because I think it would be a mistake to start by hating Democrats just because I think they have bad policy ideas. I don't think I fought quite hard enough for the tonal and dispositional moderation. I wish I had argued more for the subordinate nature of policy beneath what sounds super sissified. Oh, you're for civil discourse or something pansified that'll never win. Actually, I think the vast majority of Americans, maybe not vast majority, I think there's a significant majority of Americans who are really grossed out by political addicts, but the only choices they get are political addicts. And so I end up with a kind of 2x2 in my head that becomes something a little bit like a horseshoe. George Packer at The New Yorker had an 80-page essay 6-ish years ago that has a similar idea. So you might, if you know that essay, you know that I'm borrowing a little bit. But if ones are wokes, twos are center left, threes are center right, and fours are kind of super MAGA, it's possible to put a horseshoe on the intellectual parts of those movements and say maybe the top half, so twos and threes, are classically liberal, and maybe the bottom half of this chart, the ones and fours, are increasingly post-liberal or open to post-liberalism. And then the 2 versus 3 divide, or say the ones and twos versus the threes and fours, are policy liberals and progressives and policy conservatives. I think America is overwhelmingly a 3 nation, even though I have more conservative policy views than a lot of folks who would define themselves as super MAGA. I still want to defend classical liberalism because classical liberalism is the constitutional structure. And twos and threes don't ally much right now because most of the voice goes to ones and fours. But I think it's pretty important, and I wish I'd have done a better job of trying to persuade my constituents of this, of recognizing that ones, the super wokes, it's like 2 million people. We got a 335 million person nation, and like 0.5% of people are actually wokes. And so at the end of the day, my problem isn't really with them because they don't have any power. My political problem is with twos and fours. Twos because they're cowards. They run almost every institution and they rarely are willing to stand up to ones. And fours because they act like burning it down is a sufficient policy objective. I don't see who's served by that. So I wish I'd have fought a little harder to take the policy conservative, tonal and dispositional moderate argument I was making and argue a little bit more than tonal and dispositional moderation as a disposition and a little bit more as a defense of constitutionalism before we get to policy fights. But that's not the same as really changing a policy position. Yeah. She's bringing you the mic.
Hi, my name is Mona, and I am a rising sophomore from Boston University. So my question is, in this age of like digital age and the growth of AI and artificial intelligence and all of that, I feel like AI constantly reminds us of like being omnicompetent or like there's this infinite possibility out there, and we don't know how the world is going to develop. Along with like human intelligence. But when you were facing, this huge obstacle in your life, fighting, the terminal diagnosis that you had, what do you think that says, or how does it change your perception about true human potential, the true value, or the true possibilities of human intelligence overall?
That's really good. I am getting the signal that I have about 6 minutes left. So Mona, great question. I'm going to try to limit myself to 90 seconds so I can make a little bit more of a rapid fire finish. I think in our kind of mother may I institutionalized school system world where you get ahead by being able to check the right boxes, one of the things that's increasingly clear to me is a lot of the most interesting workers and a lot of the most interesting leaders are going to be a little more heterodox in their skill set over time, not just compliant to kind of box checking institutionalization. And one of the things that makes that hypothesis tied directly to your question is I think IQ becoming more and more commodified by these tools is going to raise the relative value of EQ by a lot. Once upon a time, the difference between 95th and 99th percentile processing speed, just straight up RAM, how fast is the motor in your brain that can do math problems, 95th to 99th percentile mattered a lot. I suspect that 15 years from now, the difference between 65th and 95th and 99th percentile is going to matter a whole lot less because we're going to have externalized a lot more of our capacity to have access to quick IQ, and we're going to have different interfaces than, I remember when some guys on my staff, on my team in the Senate, I was elected in 14, so I took office in spring of 15. By 16, I had a couple guys on my team telling me, you're trying to reply to 200 or 300 emails a day. Quit pecking them out. Go to voice to text. And I thought, oh, that interface will be terrible. And they made me pledge that I would give it 2 months and then I could go back if I didn't like it. And by 2 weeks in, the algorithm was so good that my voice to texting made me a lot faster, right? Whatever the next steps are in that interface, are going to make it such that the IQ available to us is going to be easier and easier and easier. What's going to matter much more is the EQ ability to manage that IQ. And so the things that define us as truly human are going to be more important, and you're never going to be able to commodify relationality. At the end of the day, you'll be able to fake it. There are a lot of people, I think all 50 states now have a petition where some mentally troubled person is trying to marry their LLM. Right? Like we're in about 50 states where people are trying to marry an agent. That's not love, right? It may feel really comforting that she can have the right voice and she asks me all the questions that make me feel super special. That's not a human, right? And we are headed toward a world, whether it's 3 years from now or 13 years from now, we're all going to have robots building robots for us. And that's going to make a lot of tools and a lot of tasks a lot easier. That's not the same as humanity and communion. And we need humanity and communion. And so the EQ management of, even the word management feels problematic, but the EQ management of those IQ tools are going to matter a lot more. And I think it's incumbent upon us to have enough thick community where people can call BS on the degrees to which we become asynchronously addicted to our tools. Okay. Sir. I failed at the 90-second goal on that one. I'm sorry.
Hello, I'm Nathaniel Butler. I'm a rising junior at Bryan College in Dayton, Tennessee. And I was just wondering, as someone who has served on the Senate Judiciary Committee, as well as someone like yourself who is a strong proponent of the natural rights enshrined in the Declaration of Independence, what is your view on the idea that seems to be espoused by Justice Thomas that the natural rights inside of the Declaration of Independence, those inalienable rights, are incorporated into the Constitution and a judge's ability to enforce it through the Privileges and Immunities Clause of the 14th Amendment?
Oh man, we're going to get too technical at the end there. I was on the Judiciary Committee. Thank you, Nathaniel. I was on the Judiciary Committee for lots of reasons, but one of them is because Mitch McConnell, as he says it, plays the long game. And most of y'all are probably a little bit too young to remember this, but in the 2015 to 2016 moment of the now president's campaigns, he was still trying to figure out how, as he courted, lifelong Democrat at that point, how does he court Republican primary voters? And President Trump, then candidate Trump, had said in the past that his model Supreme Court justice was his sister, who was a Third Circuit judge who was one of the most liberal living constitutionalists alive. And Leonard Leo and others were trying to persuade him to adopt a sort of FedSoc view of the world of what you should want on judges. And when President Trump won the nomination, I am not a lawyer. I worked for President Bush a little bit after 9/11, and I hired a lot of lawyers at the Justice Department when we were doing some intel and counterterrorism stuff. So I'd been around the Justice Department, and I'd hired a lot of attorneys, but I am not one, and I haven't been to law school. And Mitch McConnell came to me, and he said, you ought to go on the Judiciary Committee. And I said, that seems weird. Chuck Grassley, a farmer in the state next to me, had been on the Judiciary Committee for years, and it was always a little bit of a surprise, awkward fit. And Mitch said, if President Trump nominates strict constitutionalists to the bench, you can be the champion of them, and that will be a surprise to a lot of people, and it'll be an occasion for you and President Trump to build a relationship. And on the other hand, if he reverts back to the position he used to have, which is wanting instrumentalist judges who would try to make law, you'd be able to, in an 11-10 Judiciary Committee at that point, torpedo these nominees, and they would go down. And it seemed like a pretty good vision to me, and so I agreed to go on the Judiciary Committee. Since then, so I'm not going to get all the way to privileges and immunities, partly because they're going to give me the hook. But since then, I got to know, I sat on the Judiciary Committee during the confirmation of 3 great choices that President Trump made in his first term. And I got to know some of the debates that Justice Thomas has less patience for stare decisis than a lot of other originalists and constitutionalists on the courts, and for reasons that are tightly tied to the underlying assumptions of your question. If natural rights have been violated in previous decisions, why would we still let them stand when you could reform these previous errors of the court? And so that's about as far as this non-lawyer wants to go inside some of the originalist debates around natural rights and natural law informing judicial opinions. But I am really glad that it doesn't look like Justice Thomas or Justice Alito are retiring this term. So I think the range across a court that has been reformed in some wonderfully healthy ways in the last decade plus, I think the range inside that debate is robust and vibrant. And for those of you who are headed to law school, well worth your time and attention. I'm going to get out of your hair. Congratulations on getting to work at AEI. Thanks for pulling on oars with us, and welcome.